Hello, all. And so, continuing with our Mass of God, Volume 1 discussions, I want to now look at the Archaeology of Myth chapter. And so, essentially, Campbell is going to go as far back as we can in human history for any sort of evidence of a spiritual or religious ideas. And so, this goes all the way back to the hominids and its overall hominization process. Now, the chart that Campbell gives us, of course, dating back to 1959, is very dated, and so these figures are a bit too early, but nonetheless, we'll try to supplant them like we did earlier. Now, hominization, or at least the process of it, in a geographic capacity, seems to have taken place in Lake Turkana. We're always finding remnants of the hominids here about 7 million years ago, and this could be the earliest of our ancestors that we know of that sort of acted as a kind of upright chimpanzee. And there are different morphologies of this hominization, or different entities, if you will, until you get to Homo habilis, which is about 2.6 million years ago to 1.6 million years ago. And habilis is important instead of maybe some of these other variations in particular, because habilis is the first one that we have evidence of using stone tools. Although we did find in Olduvai George up to 3.3 million years ago. Now with habilis never gets out of Africa, but we do see the starting of a sort of moving of rocks and stones to build privacy, really, a sort of wall, if you will. And they're starting to create these semicircles out of stone. And this could very well be the first time that we see evidence in human history that we have the idea of geometry, the sort of ideals created in the mind in a sort of abstract capacity, actually having usage in the material world. So you're starting to see them mess with concepts like geometry now by the forming of these semicircles. And we also see the beginning of the sacred, really, because we have these collections out of Olduvai suggesting, as Campbell does with chimpanzees, they have this sort of fixations and development of sacrality, really, towards things like, fascinating pebbles. Observed in these chimpanzees, they will have fascinations to the stone to the point where you can't remove the stone from the chimpanzee. So they have an idea of sacredness, of having fixations or fascinations with certain objects that they have decided have a sort of meaning to them beyond just a practical use. And then, of course, we have chimps also able to swing and motion around, dance, really, around a center point. This again shows evidence that we have an establishment and fascination with distinct objects. In fact, to bring up red ochre again, Homo habilis perhaps used red ochre in association with burials. In Palestine 100,000 years ago, we see evidence of this. Now, there is the debate about habilis with regards to them having different variants to Homo ergaster, and they have the same family. Homo ergaster dates back to 1.7 million years ago in Africa. However, Homo erectus is the first to leave Africa, with Homo georgicus found in Georgia 1.8 million years ago. And so generally we see evidence until about 1 million years ago when they finally leave Africa. We have erectus sites at Kubifora with the domestication of fire for the first time in Africa with erectus. And also we see hand axes. Now these hand axes are very important because they're much too big compared to other more practical axes that Homo erectus apparently used. And these were infused with a sort of want of beautification, of sacrality. And so there definitely is a sense that some of these axes were kept for aesthetic purposes, for beauty and appreciation of the objects. And potentially, as Ebert points out in his series, there perhaps is a symbolism really with the idea of the thunderbolt. And even more so with Erectus, we see this hand axe really spread across to even parts of India. And this could potentially be an insight into the first time we have sacred art, really, as a sort of theme in human history. Now, moving on to Terra Amata in France, this is the first signal that we have of independent housing. And they are these sorts of triangles, really, with branches woven together over the beaches of Nice. This is about 300,000 years ago. Now, Homo heidelbergensis, in relation to this time period of 300,000 BC, is already the prototype of the Neanderthal after the glaciation period about 600,000 years ago. And out of that warming period, goes from Ethiopia to modern Europe. Meanwhile, in Atapuerca, Spain, we have the first burials about 300,000 years ago, where you have the cave where the dead is thrown into this large structure. And then we also have the earliest Homo sapiens appearing in Africa about 160,000 years ago. The significance about this is we find the modern Homo sapien with the connection to skulls with the back parts removed of them, and this likely gave them access to the brain. Now, Neanderthals, as we've mentioned before, they would have these skull cults where they would remove the organs of the head and also practice ritualized cannibalism, and would turn the head away from the rest of the body, and had some idea with headhunting cults in the Indonesian culture zone. And then we see the migration of modern Homo sapiens into Europe 45,000 years ago, with the beginnings of the ordination period ending about 27,000 years ago. And this period has a sort of co-inhabitation with the Cro-Magnon, where the Neanderthals are then eventually wiped out in Spain with its last vestiges, where there's a sort of hybrid boy in that region where he had Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon features. Now, this then coincides with the creativity period with the Chauvet caves at 33,000 BC, where we have the first cave art and painting to the process of the polychrome. And then moving to the Solutrean, which is a very brief period of 23,000 BC to 18,000 BC. And this is the climax of the epoch of the cult of the goddess. And our final site at the sites of the Magdalenian, we see the rise of the bow and the arrow technique, or spear throwing, and the chasing of animals off of cliffs as well from this period. Now, the Magdalenian period of 18,000 to about 10,000 BC is the final portion of the art at Lascelles and Altamira, with the climax of this art form, and then eventually you have the glacier melting, and after that you have the Dark Ages. Now, Campbell points out that about 12,000 BC to 10,000 BC in La Fontaine's Spanish period, where out of North Africa we see this art of etching and engrams of animals onto rocks, and these sites in eastern Spain where the shrinkage of the animal cults in the human form is enlarged. This is an innovation really at that time. And so the fighting with the bows and the arrows on the cliffs and off of the rock ledges, and is a huge contrast, or a flipping really, of that early Paleolithic cave art, where again the humans weren't so enlarged. In fact, you could perhaps, if you think back to Gebser and the ideas of the magical conscious structure, where the animal head would consume the human skull, now you're starting to see a difference here, a delineation from that in their relationship with the animal. Now moving across, you have Göbekli Tepe site, which is at about the same time at 10,000 BC, with the first use of the monument storm, with the T-shaped capitals and totems of animals carved on them, and the animal forms being portable and visible out in the actual daylight. So now you're starting to see these images just leaving the cave and actually be a part of the world in the light of day. At that same time, with the Natufians, we see them inheriting this tradition, and it's really the tail end with the agriculture invention along gazelle paths before moving into the Neolithic pottery A period that we talked about in the earlier chapters. Now moving to chapter 10 itself, the mythological thresholds that he wants to discuss with us, and look at the Neolithic, which starts with an account of this old myth of the great serpent of the earliest planters. And this is an Indonesian myth of a young woman who meets a serpent in the forest who asks to be her husband. She says she can't marry the snake, but he said he has the form of a snake, but the speech of a man, and this compels her to run off with him to get married and bear 2 children. The serpent subsequently sends the woman off and said that he will actually take care of these children for himself. And so the serpent starts raising the children on his own and tells them to catch fish one day. And so the children wait for the rays of the sun to cook the freshly caught fish. So the serpent is watching his children do this and insists that they need to use the power of fire. And so this fire is found deep within his belly. And so they're asked to pull it out to bring forth. And so the serpent opens the jaws, and the boys go inside of their fatherly serpent. And is a reverse, really, of the Aztecs, where we mentioned earlier about the ideas of the opening of the jaw, where the human face appears in its gullet, because for them the person has been swallowed up and absorbed, if we've talked about the conscious structures with Gebser. But nonetheless, the boy finds the fire and brings it out, and so they fish again, and this time they use it to cook it. And so the serpent asks his children, do you prefer the uncooked version of the fish or the fish with the use of domesticated fire? And of course the children said that they preferred the use with domesticated fire. And so this myth for Campbell, as he's talking about it, is really a stripping of the basic mythology of the serpent and the maiden, and is really a core feature in the equatorial zone from West Africa to the tip of India and Polynesia. And he thinks somewhere along this zone here is where the origins of this story came from. And so he really debuts this process of the mythogenetic zones concept, which is certain types of myth have geographic output. They have added the milieus and used in this sort of cartography towards the stories for that particular people in a place. And so a lot of the times Campbell insists that these can spring up in a number of locations at the same time, and there's even this distinction really between a novel mythogenic story being created within a specific locale, or you could also see, going back to Leo Frobenius at the start of this book now, there is a cultural diffusion which is transported by the people on the moon. Now, the significance of the serpent maiden are a part of 2 separate zones from Africa to southern India, and there's another zone from north and central India to southern Asia and through the Pacific. So the myth was somewhere in this zone from Africa to India, and Campbell then examines the different stages of how we have high civilization come about in really this 6-layered process of this mythogenetic zone features where they emerge and spread out, according to Campbell. And so he starts chronologically to the Australopithecines about 4 million years ago to 2.5 million years ago in this zone. And for Campbell, this is the basic zone. The second zone, which starts with Homo erectus, originated in Africa 1.8 million years ago and is the first distribution of two mythic motifs of the hand axe and the origins of human art, perhaps, and its artistic slant instead of using it for a practical usage. This is really the birth of the object in the ritual or symbolic use, and is an expression originating from Africa to India. Now in Southeast Asia, the technology is based on habilis, but in this zone across the Pacific, the fire is associated with the goddess. So we have two zones that can be traced back to Homo erectus, man. Now moving to stage or layer 3, you have the Neanderthal man out of Europe, where this zone after the last interglacial melting, we see the bear cult's burial rites and the birth of the ritual cannibal and the rite of the head hunting, and goes with the ideas of ancestral worship. And then in stage 4, we have the ordination zone of the great cave art in the eastern zone, where we see the goddess emerge in Germany and modern Ukraine. And this Franco zone, we get the great hunt and also the earliest zodiac of constellations onto the night sky, which is going to be key for the high civilization ideas in a bit. Now, stage 5 is the Spanish La Fontaine art, about 12,000 BC to 10,000 BC. And this zone might extend from North Africa to the mountains of Persia, because in this zone, the herding of cattle, sheep, and also the signs of the potentially early domestication from a spilling of the late Paleolithic worship, where we have the totems migrating to the Sahara all the way to the Atlas Mountains. They demonstrate the same domestication of animals, of goats and cattle, and also the solar ram, who makes it to Egypt to transform into the god Amun. This is what is referred to as an animal domestication zone. And then moving to zone 6, this is where the city-state emerges out of the synthesis between that northern zone, the northern Africa domestication, and the herding zone, where the southern planter culture with the serpent and maiden, and they overlap together at the crescent spot in modern Iraq and Jordan, and then in Palestine and Israel area overlapping to become the stage 6 of Egypt and legendary Mesopotamia. Now, of course, 3500 BC in Mesopotamia and 3000 BC Egypt, the two civilizations of Egypt with 2500 BC Minoan Crete, and Mesopotamia 2500 BC Harappa in India. And so Campbell then moves on to a discussion of the motivation of the mythogenetic of high civilization is one of astrology, is the study of the planet movements with mathematics. You have the idea of the written word. You also have the decimal system, record keeping, and this is the shift from the rule of the earth to the rule of the heavens, which are, have a sort of language through the stars, through the planetary alignments, to talk to high civilization. And so we see this echo to the legend of the destruction of Cash in the early myth in this book, where these myths play a part in the astrological symbolism, where the king and the court is to be sacrificed every 7 years in accordance with the 7 Saturn cycle. And so the astronomy really is the organizer of these giant city-states. And so Campbell finishes this discussion by talking of the Nana myth and to the descent of the netherworld. And so, of course, the association with the city-states of Nana and Ur, the moon god Uruk, with the sister states here, the divinities were on the father of Inanna, who was associated with Venus. Now, there are these death pits of Ur, where we get enacted with the king as the moon, and the queen, Shabbat above, was associated perhaps with the sun, or the king and the planet Venus. They're all buried, however, with these large beads and jewels. And so, out of this myth that he's going to discuss, we can perhaps have an understanding from, ancient Egypt and the third dynasties. You'll notice that in all of these burials at the time, they're very ravishing. They have many trinkets, many sacred objects. In this myth, you have the idea of the disappearance of Venus in the evening and the heralding of the rising sun. And so Nana, she descends into the underworld, and the underworld is referred to as Kur, K-U-R, is a place of the 7 gates with 7 layers of clothing she has on, and at each gate, at each layer, if you will, she has to surrender each article of her garb as she descends down into these 7 gates. And so this myth is perhaps an echo to the descent in later Hellenics of the descending of the soul, where, as the soul incarnates down on Earth, each of the planets reflect onto the material observation of one's existence by, applying to how their personality will actually be with these astral properties. And so the planets and the qualities from each destination, such as Mars and the idea of the fighting spirit, before achieving the eventual incarnation of who this being will be in the actual world. Now here we have the myth in a reversal. Nana descends to her sister, to Ereshkigal. She is the mirror of Nana. So you have the sort of polarity of above and below here. She's the mistress of the great below, and is the archetypical goddess of above and below, with the going back to the Neolithics, with the idea again of the polarity between the two. And so at each gate, she proceeds to bribe away some of her garments, and this perhaps is an insight to how in the death pits, we have all of these costly jewels and precious objects, really, as a part of the burial process. And this could perhaps be seen as, taking the bribes with you down to be judged as you go through the gates yourself into the next life. And so finally she gets down there after each gate to then be hung on a meat hook. And so Campbell says that there's 2 real things to notice of this myth here. You have the myth of the hero's descent to the underworld, is of Nana, and is perhaps the earliest echo we have of the idea of crucifixion. And then we also have the death and resurrection idea, and this is the play, of course, towards the eventual revelation of Christ's crucifixion. Now there is this other character to discuss in this myth called Ninjabur, who is rather mysterious because it's not really known what exactly they truly are, although we do know that their sort of telos in this myth is to be a messenger of the gods, a sort of Hermes, if you will. And so Nana told Ninjabur that if I'm not back in 3 days, that something has went wrong in my trip to the underworld. And so Ninjabur goes to find Inki and asks that Inanna has been gone for quite some time, and so Inki decides to take dirt from under his nails and creates these 2 creatures to go after her. And these 2 creatures exemplify the ideas of water and food combined together to create the eternal life, and instructs them to go down to revive Nana. So the creatures go down, throwing the water of life and food on Nana, and is also perhaps a call to those early Palestine burials where you have red ochre sprinkled on the dead as, again, a sort of resurrection motif we see with the ideas of the water of life. So Nana returns after being resurrected by these creatures and must sacrifice to fill the void that she is left now of the underworld. And so she returns back and sees all of the other gods mourning her. But she looks for her husband, Demuzid, and he's not mourning at all. Instead, he's actually, partying, probably being infidelious. And so she casts him to be the sacrifice to send down to the underworld. So her sister oversees the trading of the two spouses every 6 months. And this is also somewhat of a call to Persephone returning and leaving for the Hellenics' idea of the cycle of the seasons. And so this myth for Campbell is very important to see the earliest callbacks really of death and resurrection, and also the ideas of how astrology as a sort of formalization or a binding process to the destinies of the then city-states. And so I think I'm going to cap off this video for now before getting into some of these subsections with regards to the actual geographical implications of how these myths move across the planet or settle into a new territory to be re-territorialized to complement the local. And with that, I hope you guys enjoyed this video and look forward to probably our last discussion with regards to the Mass of God series. And so I hope you guys stay tuned for that, and I'll see you for the next one.